A massive boat, more like a covered awning, slowly moved across the water, and Abigail leaned on the high rails, admiring the ocean and the wild, overgrown islands that adorned this part of the coast. Abigail was incredibly happy and still couldn't believe what had happened. Not long ago, she was a poor girl from the countryside, working as a maid in a rich house. She could only sigh excitedly while looking at the owner's son. And now, the handsome Gavin was her husband, and he brought her here to rest together on a beautiful island lost in the ocean. But how did it all happen? Abigail smiled, feeling like she was in a fairy tale about the poor, unhappy Cinderella. Only instead of a fairy, she had Aunt Lynn. Lynn had been working as a cook in different rich families for many years and was delighted with her life. One day, when she came to her native village, she met with her niece and told her about the prospects that the metropolis offered to people. "Do you understand that there is an entirely different level of life there? It's just a dream. You can't imagine, Abigail, what kind of houses they have, how people live, or how much money they have." "Auntie," the girl objected with a smile, "but that's their money, not ours." "But they can become yours, silly. If I were as young and beautiful as you, I would never have stayed languishing in this backwater. Tell me, what prospects await you here? To marry some farmer or blue-collar worker and have a bunch of children who will always cling to your hem? Is that what you want?" "Auntie, why are you exaggerating so much? Of course, I'm not going to get married now. Ben and I are just dating, but I am willing to become his wife and have a couple of charming kids with him." "What does your Ben do?" "He's an auto mechanic." "That's it. Stop talking about him, please. I spent 15 years turning someone like your Ben into a normal person, and to no avail. Believe me, dear, it's impossible. I regret one thing, that I wasted those years instead of living like a human being." Abigail understood that it was pointless to argue with her aunt, but she still listened to her stories about the lives of wealthy people with pleasure. After spending a week at home, Lynn left again, and Abigail parted with her cheerful and optimistic aunt with great regret, especially since she could not come earlier than a year later. But it was not even a month later when Lynn called Abigail and demanded that she drop everything and fly to her immediately. "Abigail, we have a vacancy for a maid here, and I recommended you to my employers. Buy a plane ticket and come here. The vacancy won't wait." "Auntie, are you crazy?" exclaimed Abigail, feeling, however, how strongly her heart was beating. "What will Ben say?" "What difference does it make to him? Who is he to you? If he likes it, let him sit in his car shop and poke around in other people's cars, instead of buying himself a normal, decent car." "Auntie, we already talked about this. He doesn't have the money for it." "Then let him shut up and not interfere with you earning money." But Ben did not remain silent, and when Abigail told him that she wanted to leave, he got angry. "I can't go with you. You know perfectly well that I have a sick mother, and in addition to everything else, I take care of her." "Then I'll go alone. Ben, understand, I also want to work. My aunt says they pay well there." Abigail affectionately took her fiancé's hand, but he jerked it away. "You're just like everyone else. You only care about money. Have you thought about how we'll be, you there and me here?" "Well, what's the big deal? Even married couples live separately if one of them goes to work far away." Abigail tried to object. "People can live however they want, but I have different principles. My wife should always be here by my side," Ben replied. "Well, I'm not your wife." "What difference does it make? We have something serious between us, and I was going to propose to you, but now I'm uncertain if I should," Ben said. "Well then, stay here with your principles," Abigail shouted, "and I'm leaving tomorrow, and I won't come back to you." "Suit yourself!" Ben exclaimed in anger, hitting the wall with his fist before storming off and slamming the door behind him. Abigail burst into tears. She didn't want to leave Ben and had hoped he would understand her, but now they had foolishly quarrelled and separated forever. After standing there for another minute, Abigail ran after Ben. She wanted to apologize and tell him that she wouldn't go anywhere, that she would stay with him. When she ran out into the street, Ben was getting into his old Ford. The girl called out to him, but Ben didn't even look her way and drove off without a glance back. Seeing this, Abigail felt angry at him and firmly decided to break up with him. The next evening, she boarded a plane that easily carried her away to a new life. Aunt Lynn had been right. Abigail enjoyed working together with her at the house of Mr. and Mrs. Shartoff. They were both no longer young people and treated their servants well, never delaying their salaries. What more could Abigail dream of? Only of their son, Gavin. He had recently turned 30, but still couldn't start a family, preferring short-lived relationships with different girls. This drove Mr. Shartoff crazy, and he often threatened to disinherit his son if he didn't pull himself together. Gavin just laughed at his father's threats, knowing full well that he had a soft and laid-back character. Gavin was the only child of Mr. and Mrs. Shartoff, and he had been used to doing only what he wanted since childhood. At the same time, he had an excellent education, spoke 3 languages fluently, and helped his father a lot in his business, though he remained a restless prankster in his personal life. Lately, after breaking up with one of his passions, he had spent a lot of time in clubs and returned from there quite drunk. One evening he came home barely able to stand. Abigail, who was in the living room at the time, managed to catch Gavin to prevent him from falling. "Why don't you take care of yourself?" she said to him, helping him to his bedroom. "You're so sweet," he said, instead of answering, his tongue barely moving. "Looks like I really overdid it today. Oh, thank you. If my dad saw me in this state, it would be bad. Don't tell him, okay?" Abigail laughed. "Okay, I won't." In the bedroom, Gavin asked Abigail to undress him, and she complied, then helped him to lie down. A minute later he was already asleep, and she, standing over him for a moment, neatly folded his clothes and went to her room. From that evening on, Abigail felt her heart pounding at the sight of Gavin, and if he hadn't noticed her before, now he was throwing interested glances at the girl. This made her blush and hurry away somewhere, but one day, accidentally bumping into him in the hallway, she ended up in his arms and nearly went crazy with happiness when he kissed her. With difficulty regaining her senses, Abigail broke free from his grasp and hurriedly went to her room. Gavin, however, was not going to stop and began to constantly show her attention. And so in a very short time she fell in love with him, forgetting about everything else in the world. One night he came into her room and woke her up with a kiss. Abigail tried to resist, but she couldn't. For almost 2 weeks, Gavin came to Abigail every night, until one day Lynn caught him in bed with her niece. She had a headache and decided to ask Abigail for some pills, but when she entered the room, she froze at the sight of what she shouldn't have seen. Without hesitation, Lynn shouted for the whole house to hear, and Gavin's parents came down to find out what happened. "Your son seduced my niece," Lynn declared to Mr. Shartoff. "Of course, she's also at fault, but you can understand the girl. Naive fool believes in love at first sight, and couldn't resist him. Who will need you now? And he, as usual, is drunk. Just look at him." "Don't worry, Lynn," Gavin's father said angrily. "My son will marry your niece, since he likes her so much, and maybe I'll finally have some grandchildren." Gavin's mother cried. Gavin started shouting at his father. Abigail was crying too, huddled in the corner, Only Lynn stood calmly, with her arms crossed and a victorious look. The scandal was grandiose, and in the end, Gavin left the room, slamming the door with all his might. His parents followed him. Alone with her aunt, Abigail became brave. "Why did you do all this? I didn't want anyone to know." "Listen, since you let him into your bed, finish what you started. And think, do you want to be his wife or just another abandoned girl he wiped his feet on? Do you know why the maid who worked here before you left? Because he brainwashed her in the same way and then left her, threatening to ruin her reputation if she told someone. In the end, he paid her a little and advised her to leave his house. She wasn't lucky to have an aunt like me, and believe me, I'll make sure you become his wife, and then we'll see how it goes." Lynn kept her word, and 2 months later, Abigail became Gavin's wife. Mr. Shartoff organised a magnificent wedding, but the newlyweds couldn't go on a honeymoon because Gavin was too busy with his business. Only 6 months later, he finally managed to take 2 weeks off to rest with his wife on the ocean coast. "Listen, Gavin, can we go to some island? I saw pictures in magazines. It's so beautiful," Abigail asked her husband. "Okay," he agreed, looking at her strangely. "You'll have your island." And now they were sailing on this huge, strange boat, with a couple of locals manoeuvring it skillfully between the islands. While Abigail was admiring the beauties of nature, Gavin was talking to the ship's owner. "Is this a residential island?" he asked, pointing to a patch of land covered in lush greenery. "It used to belong to some millionaire," he replied eagerly. "Well, no one has been here for many years." "Why?" "That millionaire I told you about. He had the largest serpentarium here. He got rich from snakes, grew, crossed and sold them, as well as harvested venom for sale. Something went wrong once. Anyway, after he didn't answer the calls for a long time, people came to the island and found the millionaire and his 5 assistants dead. They all died from snake bites. The millionaire lay in his bed, covered in dozens of snakes." "And what happened next?" asked the interested Gavin. "Nothing. The millionaire had no heirs and no will. I don't know who owns the island now. It has been abandoned for many years, but the snakes have multiplied incredibly. People are afraid to come here because it's a sure death," the captain replied. Gavin looked at the captain strangely but said nothing. Abigail, who didn't know any foreign languages, didn't understand anything from the conversation between her husband and their guide, and continued to admire the surroundings calmly. When their walk ended and they returned to the island where their bungalow was, Gavin hugged his wife. "Well, are you happy?" he asked. "Yes, dear, very much," she replied. She did not see how her husband winced at her words. He once again thought about how much he hated his own wife, who was forced upon him against his wishes. Gavin gave in, realizing that this time his father was not joking and would not forgive him. But how tired he was of this stupid peasant woman. Gavin was ashamed to show her to his friends. She was nothing like his fashionable, glamorous girlfriends. But he couldn't divorce her and lose his inheritance because of this wretch. And how could he get rid of this hated wife? There was no way out, and Gavin endured, waiting for the first convenient opportunity. And now it seemed that it had come. It was the perfect solution, to take his wife to an island teeming with snakes and leave her there. Later, he could say that he didn't even suspect the danger. No one will suspect him of evil intent. And who would accuse a grieving widower who lost his young wife? People would be told that they stopped on the island for only an hour. They wanted to be alone, feel like Adam and Eve. Who would judge them for that? Then he would tear, saying that while he was unloading the boat, Abigail went into the thicket. He heard her screams, rushed to help, but it was too late. His wife, bitten by poisonous snakes, died in his arms. But he himself managed to escape a terrible death, returning to the boat. Gavin smiled. The plan was magnificent. No one would suspect anything, and everything would work out as he intended. Abigail, on the other hand, had no idea, enjoyed her lunch with an appetite, and when her husband suggested another sea walk in the evening, renting a boat for this purpose, she eagerly agreed. "Gavin, darling, this is so romantic. I love you very much." "I love you too, dear," Gavin replied calmly. "Maybe we should ask our captain," she suggested. "You can't handle boats." "I wanted to ask him too, but it's not going to work. He left an hour ago. His daughter is getting married and he took 2 weeks off. Only his assistants are left here. But don't worry, the weather won't change and I'm not planning to sail far." "Or are you afraid?" Gavin smirked. "No, what are you talking about? I'm not afraid of anything with you." "Well, that's great." Gavin confidently piloted the small boat they had rented, while Abigail admired him and felt lucky to have him as her husband. Aunt Lynn was right, she thought. One should take everything from life, and Abigail was somehow lucky. "Listen," Gavin's voice rang out. "Let's approach this island. When I was a child, I was fascinated by Robinson Crusoe's adventures, and I couldn't miss the opportunity to feel like my favourite hero, and you'll be my Friday." "Why Friday?" Abigail was surprised. "Just don't tell me you haven't read this book." "No, I didn't have time to read. I helped my mother with the household chores and also worked with her on the farm." "Okay," Gavin smiled. "It doesn't matter. Actually, well, we docked. Welcome to the deserted island." "Why is it deserted? Look, there are some buildings over there." "Yes, exactly. Well, you can go and see what's there while I get our supplies out of the boat." Abigail took only a few steps along the overgrown path and immediately found herself in a real jungle. She turned around to call Gavin and saw him sailing away, leaving her on the island. "Gavin! Gavin, where are you going?" She rushed to him, but he didn't even turn at her voice. After a few minutes, he disappeared from sight, circling the island. Abigail was left alone. Confused, not understanding anything, the girl burst into tears. She did not expect such a move from her husband and was terrified. Abigail spent an hour on the shore, hoping Gavin would return soon. Then she decided to get to the house, hidden deep on the island, and see if there was a phone there. But as soon as she entered the surrounding jungle, she heard a vicious hissing and instinctively jumped back, screaming in horror. Several snakes were writhing under her foot, and a giant python hung from the nearest tree, swaying its triangular head. Abigail ran to the shore, only now noticing that the sand was marked with strange stripes. Snakes crawled out to bask in the sun, leaving their traces on the sand. Abigail yelled incessantly, and when she saw Gavin's boat, she fell unconscious on the hot sand. Gavin, pleased that his plan had worked, loaded his wife's lifeless body into the boat and hurried to his safe island. Then he carried her in his arms, planning to call for help. But then Abigail came to her senses, jumped to her feet, and attacked her husband, slapping him in the face. "You left me there! You left me! Wanted those creatures to eat me! I hate you! I hate you!" The bewildered Gavin tried to justify himself, but she didn't even listen and demanded that they return home immediately. "I beg you, don't tell my father anything." "Why, should I pity you? Didn't you pity me? I don't understand why you did this." "Because I wasn't supposed to marry you. I didn't want to." "What did you want? Just to have fun?" Do you think that's fair? I don't think so. I am also a living person with feelings and a soul. I married you not for money, but because I loved you. But don't worry. As soon as we get back, I will file for divorce myself, and I will tell your father that you are not to blame for anything. What do I owe you for this? Nothing. Just make sure I never see you again. A few days later, Abigail and Gavin were back home and filed for divorce. Aunt Lynn was shocked by her niece's decision, but Abigail never told her why she refused to stay married to Gavin. I'm going back home, she said. I don't need this beautiful life, soaked in hypocrisy and lies. Lynn just sighed in response. Abigail returned to her hometown, thinking about how much she wanted to see Ben. She even went to his auto repair shop, but it turned out that he no longer worked there. Don't you know, his partner Paul asked her, almost right after you left, Ben got into a car accident. He had a very hard time dealing with your breakup. He's dead? Abigail exclaimed. No, he's alive, but he can only move around in a wheelchair now. He needs money for treatment. We and our friends have pitched in, but it's just a drop in the bucket. Abigail didn't say anything else, turned around and walked away. At home, she called Gavin. Listen, I would never ask you for help, but I want you to help one person. He needs to get back on his feet. My life for his life. This is my only request. Okay, I'll do everything. We have acquaintances in Germany. They will help, Gavin said. And also, Abigail, please forgive me. 3 years passed. Abigail was married to Ben, gave birth to a son for him, and only then realized that she was perfectly happy. Ben knew where the money for his treatment came from. Abigail confessed everything to him. We shouldn't part with you, Ben said. When we're not together, we make many mistakes. Yes, because happiness is only where there is love, Abigail replied, hugging her husband.